The call came in around noon. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a disturbance at an old house on the edge of town. My first day on the force, and I was itching to prove myself. The dispatcher said it sounded like a simple domestic dispute. Some old man screaming at his neighbors, maybe. They gave me the address, and I was off. The house was a relic from another era, sagging under the weight of neglect. The yard was a jungle of overgrown weeds, and the porch sagged like a broken limb. As I approached, I noticed the windows were grimy, obscured by years of dirt and dust, making it impossible to see inside. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the stillness. "Police, anyone home?" I called out. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway cluttered with old furniture and stacks of newspapers. "Hello? Police officer, I'm here to help," I announced, stepping inside. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. My hand instinctively moved to the grip of my gun. As I ventured further, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible shuffling noise coming from the back of the house. "Sir, ma'am, I'm coming in," I said, my voice steady. The shuffling grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor. I rounded a corner into the kitchen, and the sight that met my eyes stopped me cold. An elderly man was lying on the floor, his body contorted in a way that no living person could manage. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his mouth was twisted in a silent scream. "Jesus," I muttered, rushing to his side. I checked for a pulse, but found none. That's when I noticed the blood, a thick, dark pool spreading out from under him. I called it in, requesting backup and an ambulance, though I knew it was too late for the latter. As I waited, I decided to check the rest of the house. The shuffling noise continued, growing more distinct and closer. I followed the sound to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I was hit with a wave of putrid air. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light being a small, grimy window. In the center of the room was a large wooden wardrobe. The shuffling was coming from inside. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. With one swift motion, I flung the wardrobe doors open, and there, amidst a pile of old clothes and junk, was a young woman, her eyes wild with terror. "Please don't hurt me," she whimpered, recoiling from the light. "It's okay," I said softly, reaching out a hand. "I'm here to help. What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Sarah, can you tell me what happened here?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He kept us here. Wouldn't let us leave." "Who did?" I asked. But she just kept shaking her head, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting him to return at any moment. I helped her out of the wardrobe and guided her towards the front of the house. "Stay here," I said. "Backup is on the way." As I turned to go back inside, she grabbed my arm. "Wait. There's more. In the basement." The basement. I hadn't even noticed a door to a basement. "Okay, stay put," I said, trying to reassure her. I headed back inside, my senses on high alert. It took me a few minutes, but I finally found the basement door hidden behind a stack of old boxes. The door was heavy, made of thick wood, and it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The air that wafted up from below was dank and cold, sending a shiver down my spine. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was vast, lined with old shelves and more piles of junk. But in the far corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A series of cages, each containing a person. They were emaciated, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Some were unconscious, others moaned softly. I rushed over, my mind racing. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm here to get you out." As I worked to open the cages, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see a man standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the light. He was holding something in his hand, something long and sharp. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Police," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Put the weapon down." He didn't move. Instead, he started down the stairs, his eyes locked on mine. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Put it down!" I commanded, drawing my gun. He paused, his eyes flickering with something like recognition. Then with a snarl, he lunged at me. The next few moments were a blur of motion and noise. I fired, the shot echoing through the basement. The man fell, the knife clattering to the floor. I stood there, breathing heavily, my hands shaking. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, but I knew I had to keep it together. I finished freeing the captives, and soon the house was swarming with police and paramedics. As they carried the survivors out, one of the detectives approached me. "Hell of a first day, huh?" "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "Hell of a first day." In the days that followed, the details of the case came to light. The old man had been a recluse, his descent into madness hidden from the world. He had kept his victims trapped in the basement for years, feeding off their fear and suffering. Sarah, it turned out, had been his first victim. She had been reported missing over a decade ago, and her family had long since given up hope of finding her. She was the one who had managed to escape her cage and find a way to call for help. As for me, that first day on the job changed everything. I had wanted to prove myself, and I did. But at what cost? The horrors I had witnessed would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of everyday life. The Smiths' residence loomed large and old at the end of a gravel driveway, the late summer sun casting long, eerie shadows over its peeling white paint. I'd been babysitting for a few years now, but this was my first time with the Smith kids, Danny, 8, and Ella, 6. Mrs. Smith had left in a hurry, promising she'd be back by midnight. I waved her off and turned to face the two children, their faces blank with curiosity. The evening started innocently enough. I fixed the kids some macaroni and cheese, and we watched cartoons together. Danny seemed shy but well-mannered, and Ella, though quiet, had a sweet smile that made me feel at ease. It was around 9 p.m. when I tucked them into bed, reading them a story until they drifted off. As I descended the creaky stairs, I settled on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. The house was old and creaky, every sound amplified in the silence. I shrugged off the eerie feeling that seemed to settle over the room. That's when my phone rang. I frowned. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered. "Hello?" There was a long pause, filled only with static. I was about to hang up when a voice, distorted and barely audible, whispered, "Have you checked on the children?" A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the baby monitor on the coffee table, the screen showing Danny and Ella sound asleep. My logical mind told me it was just a prank call, but something in the voice felt wrong. I hung up and tried to shake off the unease. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID was blank. I picked it up with trembling hands. "Who is this?" The same static-filled silence, followed by the same whisper, more insistent now. "Check on the children." My heart pounded as I crept upstairs, peeking into the children's room. They were still asleep, undisturbed. I exhaled, relieved, and returned to the living room, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. The third call came almost immediately after I sat down. The voice was different now, more menacing. "If you don't check on the children, something bad will happen." Fear surged through me, and I bolted upstairs, flinging the door open. The room was as I had left it, but Danny's bed was empty. Panic welled up as I scanned the room, finding him standing in the corner, his back to me. "Danny?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, my heart racing. Just as I reached out to touch him, his head snapped around, eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth moving without making a sound. The baby monitor crackled to life, and I could hear a low, guttural whisper repeating, "Check on the children." I grabbed Danny, pulling him back to bed, and tucked him in tightly, my hands shaking. As I did, I heard the soft, creaking footsteps behind me. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. Desperate to break the tension, I picked up the baby monitor, thinking it might be malfunctioning. The screen flickered, showing static before focusing back on the children. This time, there was a shadowy figure standing at the foot of Ella's bed, its form indistinct but looming. I blinked, and it was gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I called Mrs. Smith, hoping for some reassurance. The phone rang and rang. but there was no answer. I was about to hang up when a voice came through. But it wasn't Mrs. Smith. It was the same distorted whisper from the calls, saying, "They're not your children." Terrified, I ran back to the children's room, nearly tripping on the stairs in my haste. I found them both awake, sitting up in bed, staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "The man," Ella whispered. "The man with no face. He's watching us." A shiver ran down my spine. I looked around the room, but it was just us. "There's no one here, sweetie. You're safe." But as I turned off the light, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, something tall and dark, standing in the doorway. I slammed the door shut, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was this faceless man? The phone rang again, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, I answered. "Leave the house," the voice hissed. "Leave now, or you will never leave at all." I grabbed the children, my heart pounding in my chest. We ran downstairs, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Just as we reached the front door, it swung open, revealing Mrs. Smith standing there, her eyes wide with shock. "What's going on?" she demanded. I don't know," I stammered. "There were calls. And a man. The children." She looked past me, her face paling. "The children?" she whispered. I turned, my blood running cold. Danny and Ella were gone. My first day as a plumber started like any other. A call came in from an older woman in a creaky old house on the edge of town, reporting severe leaks in her kitchen. I was eager to make a good impression and maybe score a repeat customer. I had no idea what I was in for. When I arrived, the house was shrouded in an unsettling stillness. The lady, Mrs. Weaver, was a frail, wiry woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. She led me into the kitchen, where water was steadily pooling under the sink, spreading out across the faded linoleum. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said in a voice that quivered like dry leaves. "It's been like this for days. I've had trouble getting someone out here." I nodded and got to work, sliding under the sink with my flashlight in hand. The smell hit me first, something foul and putrid, far worse than just mold or mildew. The pipes were ancient, corroded, and clearly the source of the leak. As I began to dismantle them, a thick, dark sludge oozed out, filling the air with a nauseating stench. "Looks like you've got some serious blockage here, Mrs. Weaver," I called out, trying to keep the disgust out of my voice. She didn't respond. When I glanced over my shoulder, she was standing in the doorway, watching me with those unnervingly sharp eyes. I turned back to the pipes, focusing on clearing the obstruction. As I pulled out handfuls of the thick muck, I noticed something odd. Among the sludge were small bones, animal bones, I thought at first. But then I saw what looked like tiny human-like fingers, complete with nails. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept working, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a rat had gotten stuck in the pipes and decomposed? But the fingers, they were too perfect, too intact. As I probed deeper, my flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. The silence was oppressive, and the smell seemed to grow stronger, almost as if it were pressing down on me. "Mrs. Weaver," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the confined space. "Do you have another flashlight?" No response. I scrambled out from under the sink, my hands covered in the vile sludge, and found the kitchen empty. Mrs. Weaver was gone. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak light to navigate the dim room. That's when I saw it. A small wooden door in the corner of the kitchen, slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. Curiosity and dread battled within me. But the plumber in me needed to know where the pipes led. I pushed open the door and descended the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing ominously. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with the same overpowering stench. My phone's light swept across the room, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. There were jars, dozens of them, lined up on shelves, filled with murky liquid and what looked like more of those tiny bones. In the center of the room was an old, rusted tub, connected to the pipes that ran up into the kitchen. Inside the tub was the source of the blockage. A grotesque, half-decomposed figure, its limbs twisted unnaturally, and its face frozen in a grimace of pain. The fingers, they matched the ones I'd found in the pipes. Panic gripped me, and I stumbled back, knocking over one of the jars. It shattered, spilling its foul contents across the floor. I turned to flee, but there, at the top of the stairs, stood Mrs. Weaver. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, and a twisted smile played on her lips. "You weren't supposed to see this," she said softly, almost kindly. "But now that you have—" I didn't wait to hear the rest. I bolted past her, adrenaline fueling my sprint through the house and out the door. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my van, my heart pounding and my mind racing. I reported what I'd seen to the authorities, but when they arrived, the house was empty. The jars, the body in the tub, everything was gone. Mrs. Weaver had vanished without a trace. That was my first and last day as a plumber. The memory of those tiny fingers in the pipes still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that Mrs. Weaver is still out there, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble into her web.